Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Glowing Springs High School. At this time, we will please ask you to silence your cell phones. Before we introduce Jeff Lowdermilk, who will be presenting today, we will begin with our JOTC Color Guard presenting the colors. If you are able, please rise for the national anthem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Please be seated. You're good to go. When that changes.
Jeff Lowdermilk's slideshow presentation is based on his book, Honoring the Doughboys, Following My Grandfather's World War I Diary. It presents contemporary photographs taken by the author and paired with diary entries written by his grandfather, George A. Carlson, who was born in Denver, Colorado in 1894, and was a soldier in the U.S. Army during World War I. He follows his grandfather's path through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. His photographs and engaging stories bring the diary to life and offer a moving expression of gratitude to American veterans of the Great War. He has given his presentation many times, including at the World War I Museum in Kansas City, History of Colorado, New Mexico History Museum, Missouri History Museum, and the New Mexico National Guard. His photographs are highlighted in the 2010 Annual Report of the American Battle Monuments Commission, ABMC, and used in their presentations to Congress. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Lowdermilk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Having Jacob introduce me today was very, very special because Jacob and his father Houston and his grandfather Gerald are some of my greatest supporters in this project and my book. So it was very meaningful to have my friend Jacob introduce me. And welcome to all of you. This is so fantastic. And what I want to do is turn this theater into a time machine. And we're going to go back to 1918. But first, I would like to recognize the veterans who are in our group. Would the veterans please stand? Thank you, Jerry. We can never thank our veterans enough for all that they've done for our country. Now, I have some thank yous also. Of course, to the Glenwood Springs High School, but a huge thank you to Senior Master Sergeant Greg Pfeiffer, retired, who is sitting right back here. And if you could stand for a moment, please, Greg. Greg and his wife, Jessica, on the other side, they both run this wonderful ROTC program here at the high school. And Greg he's the one that did all this. I talked to Greg months ago and I said, Greg, let's do something for Veterans Day. And do you think you can get the theater or something at the high school? Oh yeah, sure, I'll take care of it. And he just goes off and does all this. It's just magic what you do. And I can't thank you enough, Greg. I appreciate everything you've done. Now, in 2 days, it will be Veterans Day. The 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month. Now, why is it that Veterans Day is always on November the 11th? It's always on November the 11th. Well, there's a very, very good reason. November the 11th, at 11 a.m., the First World War, or then it was called the Great War, ended with the armistice. It was Armistice Day. Armistice means the ceasefire. So the German army signed the armistice with the Allies, the French, the British, and the Americans. And up to 1954, it was a national holiday. No, it was Armistice Day. But in 1954, General Eisenhower signed legislation that changed Armistice Day to Veterans Day. I can remember my mother telling me that when this happened, my grandfather, in a very sad voice, said, "They've taken our day from us." But it's wonderful that we honor all of our veterans, absolutely. But the meaning of November the 11th has been lost to time. And I think in school, if you haven't heard it yet, it's 11-11-11. Now, the armistice was actually signed about 5:30 in the morning, but it was some bureaucrat that said, well, 11-11-11, that's something that will last through time. the 11th hour. So the armistice didn't actually take place until 11 in the morning. And sadly, that morning turned into one of the bloodiest days of the war. Sad story. But as we get started here, well, let me say a few more things. If you go to a Veterans Day ceremony, a parade, whatever it is, at 11 o'clock in the morning, that's when the jets fly over, the band fires up, the honorary volley goes off. Always at 11 in the morning. So all of the symbology is there, but no one remembers why. So now all of you know why Veterans Day is on the 11th of November. This year will be the 107th anniversary of the armistice of the First World War. So, to get started, here's my book, and Helen Patton is a good friend of mine. Her grandfather was the great World War II general, and Helen and I have been friends for, boy, we're close to 20 years now. She wrote the foreword for my book, which I'm just honored, and she was also singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic when you all came in. And she recorded that beautiful song for my slideshow. So thank you, Helen. And I have to thank my wife, Annie, over here, who's being very quiet, but without her love and support, none of this would have ever happened. So thank you, dear. So this little road, I know my grandfather and his regiment, they marched down this road. I know that. And so that's why it's the cover of my book. Now, so where do you start talking about the Great War? Well, this is where I start. This is the train depot at the little border town of Columbus, New Mexico. Now, what in the world does that mean? It was Pancho Villa who raided the little town of Columbus in the middle of the night on March the 9th, 1916. And just to the east is El Paso and Fort Bliss. And then Brigadier General John J. Pershing was the commanded Fort Bliss. So almost immediately he was ordered to go after Pancho Villa in northern Mexico and bring him to justice. Now, in all of the getting ready for this expedition, he needed an aide de camp. Does anyone know who became his aide de camp? It was Patton. Young George S. Patton Jr., to be extremely famous in the Second World War. So those two of the greatest military stories in American history came out of the swirling dust of Columbus, New Mexico. Now, I'm always asked the question, why did they call the American soldiers of the First World War, or the Great War, doughboys? Well, on this expedition, it was called the Punitive Expedition, that Pershing and Patton took troops into northern Mexico. And as the infantry marched in the alkaline deserts of northern Mexico, they were covered in white dust. They looked as though they'd been rolled in flour. And they started to call each other doughboys. That's the origin of why the World War I soldiers became doughboys. Because they chased Pancho Villa around for about 11 months. And they probably never even came close. But they were finally called out. And see, this is March of 1916. And April the 6th, 1917 is when the United States declared war on Germany. So the doughboys were some of the first to sign up to go to France. And a great many of them ended up in the 1st Division, which was the first division to go to France, to Paris. And so the doughboys stuck. And of course, General Pershing was appointed the commanding general of the U.S. military in Europe. And Patton also was in Europe early on, and we'll tell stories about Patton later. But here we are. Columbus kind of started this whole thing, and Columbus, this whole expedition, they had a couple of Curtiss airplanes. They had a crazy-looking tank, I've seen it, on 4 rubber tires, and they used trucks for the first time in the U.S. Army. So in a way, unknowingly, they were training for the First World War. So this has a lot of history behind it, and it's worth any of you looking this raid of Pancho Villa up, because it's a fascinating story. Now, here's my grandfather. He was, as Jacob said, he was born in Denver in 1894. And here he's 13, 14, and you can see he's a paper boy. And look how he's dressed for school. Isn't that amazing? He has knickers and his boots laced up. And on his paper route, he delivered papers to Molly Brown in Denver, the unsinkable Molly Brown. And for those of you who don't know who she is, you should look her up. She survived the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic, and was known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. So one day, Molly Brown came out and talked to my grandfather. And now, Granddad, his parents were both from Sweden, Swedish immigrants. And Granddad was the first born in America. So Molly Brown comes out, and she said, "George, could you help on the weekends and take care of my garden?" Well, sure. So on the weekends, Granddad would go to Molly Brown's house, and he took care of her garden. And I love this because later in life, Granddad's profession was, he was a horticulturist, and ultimately became the superintendent of Denver Parks. So that was his whole life, was planting and planning beautiful parks and parkways and on and on. And I love to think that it all started with Molly Brown's garden. Now, here I am with my grandparents, Dorothy and George, and I had just graduated from high school. See how time works us all over? So there's young Jeff, and this picture tells a lot. It's very, very close to my grandparents. And when I was a little boy, I know at least 10 years old, in that range, Granddad started telling me his stories about World War I. So a lot of what is in my book and these stories that you're going to hear, you know, I've known those stories all my life. So Granddad kept this diary in the First World War, and when he passed away in 1983, so you can see I knew my grandfather for 30-some years, and when he passed away, my mother gave me his diary and his division book. Very important to have that division book, because you can follow your ancestors in the First and Second World Wars. So Annie can attest. We were raising our young family and busy with my career, and the diary went into the safe, and for years. And finally one day I thought, I've got to take this out and read it. Well, I was fascinated. But I thought, there's so much behind Granddad's story, I need to learn about World War I. So I started reading everything I could. I just read everything I could, and I bought maps, and Annie can attest, I had the maps of France all over the kitchen table, and I was plotting Granddad's trail, his path, and then one year, it was 2002, I decided, well, I've got to go. So that's how all this began. And when I was a young man, Granddad took me to Pueblo, Colorado. There's a little park called Elizabeth Park. And there's this wonderful statue of the Doughboy on Sentry, and honoring the soldiers and sailors of the Great War, the World War, see. But what's so wonderful here is this symbol. This is the symbol of my grandfather's division. He was in the 89th Division. And this symbol, which I'm wearing on my lapel, is called the rolling W. And what it means is most of World War I and II, for that matter, the Army pulled their divisions out of geographic locations. So the rolling W, or the 89th Division, came out of Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Colorado, and New Mexico. So they were known as the Midwest Division. So when the rolling W rolls, it turns into an M, and then back to a W. Midwest, Midwest. So that's the symbology of the rolling W. Now here we are, grandfather and grandson. And I know Granddad had his picture taken in Prüm, Germany, after the armistice, and by the YMCA, and we still have his photograph. It's just beautiful. And there's the 89th Division, and he was in the 353rd Infantry Regiment. And here I am, many years later, following his path, and I'm wearing my rolling W. There is no glory in war. This is the American cemetery of the Meuse-Argonne. I took this photograph the day before the armistice. And it's very meaningful to me because always as I walk down rows of crosses with these young men, and there are nurses in here too. It's not just men. But these young men, are there any seniors in the class? No? You're close. Here's a senior. They're all 18, 19, 20 years old. Now, one thing I wanted to express to you young people. Humanity doesn't change. Human beings do not change. We all have our families, our friends, our dreams. The only thing that changes in war is the technology. That's it. All these young men and women, their lives were taken from them at a very young age. But when I walk down these rows of crosses, I always say their names aloud. When was the last time someone said their name aloud? Now, this is very important to me because as I was walking along and saying their names, I was in Europe at that time, following Granddad's diary, yes, but it was more of a curiosity. Where are these places? What do they look like? And I went at the same time of year that these great battles took place in the fall. But I stopped and I looked and I said, all these brave Americans, they've been forgotten. And it was at that moment I decided I had to write a book. I had to honor all of these brave Americans. So this is where this happened. Now, another thing this photograph tells us, and by the way, this is only a handful of the Americans that are still buried in Europe. There's 8 cemeteries in Europe, World War I. So this is just a handful. But these cemeteries were established in 1924. General Pershing founded the American Battle Monuments Commission. And he went back to France personally and oversaw the construction of these great cemeteries. And they're under the management of the ABMC, American Battle Monuments Commission. And every family in World War I and II, they were given the opportunity to either have their loved one be buried on the land and the soil of the land that they had liberated, or Uncle Sam would bring them home. And the way it works, generally, for both wars, is 60% of the bodies went home and 40% are buried in ABMC foreign cemeteries and monuments. So that's the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Then our cemeteries here are under the control of Veterans Administration. Now, where are we going? So here's our map. We'll get our bearings here. Here's England, the English Channel, and here's Paris. So that'll give us our bearings. And here, this little town of Chaumont is where General Pershing had his headquarters. He had his headquarters here for a very specific, several very specific reasons. Excuse me. One, it's close to the front lines, but he didn't want to be in Paris. He wanted to be outside of Paris, so his command wouldn't have the temptations of Paris. So that's why he was in Chaumont. Now, many divisions trained near Chaumont. And my grandfather was here in the 353rd Infantry Regiment, trained in this little town of Manoir. I've been to all these places. And it was the end of July 1918 that Pershing gathered all of these divisions and started northward to engage the German army here, which was called the Saint Mihiel Offensive. There's the little town of Saint Mihiel. And right in here was getting to be late August. And Pershing did something extremely important. He formed the American First Army. Now, our veterans know what an army means, but I will explain it quickly. In a World War I American division, there were 27,000 men. Enormous. So then, if you gather 2, 3 divisions, then you have a corps. And then if you gather 2 or 3 corps, that makes an army. So you can see what an enormous force an army is. So here he established First Army. Now, when the Americans started coming over, in late 1917 and then early in in 1918. The British, our allies, the British and the French, they wanted the American soldiers to replace all those that they had lost their depleted ranks in the French and British armies. And Pershing would not stand for any of that. He said, we will fight as the American army. So when he formed First Army, he was letting all his commanders and the British and the French know that that was not going to happen. They were going to fight as the American army. So, whoops. How did we get messed up here? So this solid red line is the front line on September the 25th, 1918. And there was a pocket here, it's called a salient. So this red line actually came down into Saint Mihiel. And then the blue line traces the 89th Division. And we'll get into all this a little later. But when the armistice was signed, that's the dash line. That's where all the forces came together and stopped. And here's the little town of Stenay, which you'll see photographs of a little later on. That's where my grandfather and his regiment, that's where they were at 11 in the morning of November the 11th. So this battle here at Saint Mihiel, it was a surprise attack. Pershing did a superb job, and it only lasted a few days. And then Pershing started moving the army northward to engage the German army here at the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And then they started pushing the Germans back, and at Stenay was the armistice, and then the 89th continued. It was after Thanksgiving, 1918. They walked across Belgium, Luxembourg, and into Germany here. And here's Trier, where Greg and I were talking about earlier. And then here's Prüm. Granddad was kind of the station in Prüm. Then they stayed in a little town over here called Flagrand. So this gives us an idea of where we're going with this story. Now, this wonderful statue needs a little TLC, but this is in the town of Chaumont, where Pershing had his headquarters. And what we're looking at here is the allegorical mother of France. And she has her left arm around the French soldier, and they were called the poilus. And her right hand, she's thanking the American doughboy. And I've seen many sculptures like this in the American sectors of the First World War. So this is just beautiful, the sentiment. So let's see what Granddad has to say about Chaumont. Now remember, they were in the town of Manois. So on July 13th marched 30 kilometers to General Pershing's headquarters. So they went to Chaumont. On the 14th of July, France's Liberty Day, okay? So we passed in review and then had something to eat. And I met a friend who was a mail clerk, and he had me eat with him. And I'm here to tell you, I love the way Granddad talks about this. I'm here to tell you. We had some big dinner, the best I'd had in the Army, this being Mama's birthday. It was some celebration. Now, my grandfather's birthday is the next day, the 15th. My birthday, he says, put in back to camp. Not so good. So that's how his birthday went. And France's Liberty Day is Bastille Day, of course. So now, this monument, it's an American monument built by the ABMC, is called Monsec. It's on a high promontory, high hill, Mount Sec, and you know it has the look of Jefferson's Memorial, and it's a magnificent, magnificent structure, and it commemorates the American sacrifice at the Battle of Saint Mihiel, the Saint Mihiel offensive. Now I look at the Saint Mihiel offensive as a series of firsts for the American Army. First, it was First Army, right? We know that. But it was also the largest battle the United States had been in since the Civil War. Isn't that amazing? Other firsts? He was young Lieutenant Colonel George Patton Jr. commanded the first tank battle in American history at the Saint Mihiel offensive. Amazing. And it's the first time for the Air Force here. I see Jerry's Air Force. It's the first time the United States, it was the Army Air Corps, but they flew in support of the infantry. It's the first time the United States had ever gone into battle with aircraft. Now, the crazy thing is we didn't have, we never made, I think we shipped over one plane during the whole war. We fought with the French planes and the English biplanes. And this whole effort was commanded by General Billy Mitchell. And I encourage all you young people to look up Billy Mitchell. He was the father of the modern American Air Force. And this is where it all began. So you can tell, as I'm telling these stories, this is all the very beginning of the U.S. military. A series of firsts. So let's hear what Granddad had to say about Saint Mihiel. if I get to the right page here. The battle began on September the 12th. September the 11th, we ate supper out in the trench, and the rain was coming down. This was about 6 o'clock. Then we went up the trench through the town of Laimi, and in front of it, where we stayed in water up to our knees, and the rain coming down. The barrage, the artillery barrage, started at about 1:10, Granddad's very precise, on the morning of the 12th. This was kept up till about 5:20 in the morning, when we went over what is called the top. Now, over the top has become a phrase in our lexicon. And I don't know if you young people use over the top, but you know, that party was over the top. That football game was over the top. You know, you think of a million ways to use over the top, but what did it really mean? Here are these guys. They have boiled wool uniforms that are soaking wet. They have a 90-pound backpack on, and their rifle, their hobnail boots, caked with mud. And over the top meant they had to crawl out of that trench, and it's still raining, right? And run into German machine gun fire. That's what over the top really meant. So, for the 90th anniversary, I thought I'm going to walk Granddad's path on the morning of the 12th of September. And I stayed at a little town further north than we are here. And I remember I set the alarm for 4:30 in the morning, because I thought, you know, Granddad says they went over the top at 5:20 or something, so I've got to get down there. And it was crazy. My alarm went off 4:30. I'm stumbling around, I get the alarm off, and then I opened the curtains, and there was a street light across from me, and it was pouring buckets of rain. And my first instinct was, oh, great! This is just how Granddad had it. It was raining. Isn't this great? And then I thought, oh my God, what am I doing? And so, but I kept going, and I got in the car, and I drove down to Laimi and parked by a barn. And I have to admit, I sat there for a few moments, and then I said, Jeff, you have an umbrella, you have Gore-Tex, and there's nobody shooting at you. Get going. So I did. And I walked. It was something close to 20 miles to the town of Tiacor, where there's the American Saint-Mihiel Cemetery. So I was walking to the cemetery. And I went through these little towns, and it was a beautiful walk, and it had stopped raining, thankfully. It was just beautiful. And then I get to our cemetery, and this was all part of part of the plan, I went right to this grave. He's the only Medal of Honor winner, or awarded Medal of Honor in the cemetery. About 2,400 Americans are buried in this cemetery, the San Miguel. And you can see John Hunter Wickersham, 2nd Lieutenant, 353rd Infantry, 89th Division. So that was Granddad's regiment in his division. And Mr. Wickersham was from Denver. And I've always wondered, I'll never know, did they know each other? But I'll never know. But it's very special to me because in that entire cemetery, Mr. Wickersham gives me a connection to my grandfather. Now, interestingly, for the Air Force, again, the San Miguel American Cemetery is an extremely important cemetery for the Air Force. And Air Force generals and officers and enlisted men, they take really a pilgrimage to this cemetery because there's over 100 airmen who were killed in this battle and are buried here at San Miguel. In fact, General Billy Mitchell's brother is buried in this cemetery. So, like all of our cemeteries, they're beautifully manicured. They're like beautiful parks. They're absolutely glorious, and I recommend anybody going to Europe or almost anywhere look and see if there's a U.S. cemetery to visit. Now, at the base of the American Eagle here, this says, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds," which was a very famous quote of General Pershing's. But indeed, time has dimmed the glory of their deeds. So that's why I'm here. That's why I wrote my book. We have to remember these brave Americans and what it means to our history. Now, this area was part of the San Miguel Offensive, so this was part of the battleground. And I call this photograph Swords into Plowshares, literally. So I love that shot. Now, this is a few days later, and I was at the little town of Fleury, and it was near Limey, where my grandfather, where they called jump off, right? They jumped off. And he said that's where they started the attack. They jumped off. But this was also on that the battle line, the German battle line for the San Miguel Offensive. And this was the 90th anniversary ceremony going on. And you can tell it's raining. Here's the, whoops, good God, sorry. Okay, so here's a doughboy, right? But he's French, and he probably can't speak English. But he's all dressed as the doughboy and holding Old Glory, and right behind him, this gentleman here, this young fellow here, he's a poilu, a French soldier. And so there's a band playing and all this going on. And then a guy came out of the crowd, a French fellow came out of the crowd, and he was kind of pushing people away, and he introduced a guest who was going to sing. And he said, Helen Patton. And I'm under my little umbrella clicking away with my camera, and I went, Helen Patton? And I knew her grandfather had been just north of Fleury, is where he led the first tank battle. And I thought, my God, this is amazing. And she stood there and, without an umbrella, in the rain, and sang Amazing Grace a cappella. And you could tell with Helen's voice earlier, she has a beautiful voice. It just, the crowd was so cool. I mean, you could have dropped a pin. It was just beautiful. So after the ceremony, the French always have what they call the vin d'honneur, which is a reception, but the vin d'honneur is the wine of honor. So every French ceremony is followed by the vin d'honneur. So I get to the vin d'honneur and I find Helen and introduce myself. And look at that neat tie this guy's wearing here, huh? So Helen and I are chatting away, and then Helen noticed an older gentleman, a big guy, he's a large man, bald, and he's walking across the wet grass to get to the tent, but he's making a beeline for Helen. And Helen sees him, and they embrace, and they're old friends. And this wonderful, wonderful man is Remy Foch. F-O-C-H, Foch. Remy's great-grandfather was Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was the commanding general of all of the Allied armies in France, in Belgium. His great-grandfather was General Pershing's boss. So I'm standing there just absolutely numb. My legs had turned to rubber, and thank God a little voice said, Jeff, take a picture. So here's Patton and Foch in the same frame. And Remy and I went on to be good friends. Saw him many times in Paris, and then Helen and I, we've been friends, like I said, almost 20 years. So all this is just a marvelous story. But Remy has since passed away, which is very sad, but he was just such an incredible gentleman. Now, if you recall on the map, after the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, Pershing moved First Army, and this is the planes, the aerodrome, the truck, everything. I mean, you can imagine this massive string of equipment and men and trucks and on and on and on. And they had to go about 50 miles to the staging area for the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They had to surprise the Germans, so they traveled at night without any lights. They couldn't, the old trucks couldn't turn on their lights. So all this, and it was a surprise. And in George Marshall, of World War II fame, was the mastermind behind this whole thing. They arrive at the Meuse-Argonne and start their offensive on the 26th of September. Pershing's moving fast. And the Meuse-Argonne, the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, the offensive, this is the largest and deadliest battle in American history that no one knows about. 1.2 million soldiers on the front lines at the same time. I mean, get your mind around that. 1.2 million. And this is the largest cemetery, American cemetery in Europe. 15,000 of our heroes are buried here. And you can see the headstones, and then there's the same thing over here. The largest battle in American history. This was another shot. It was the eve of the armistice. I've had the honor of being the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery 4 times in my life. And it's just incredible. See, this is the battle, the giant battle, the gargantuous battle that forced the Germans to surrender. This is where it happened. This was the American effort that caused that. Now, I show this too because, see, there's a Star of David right there. And I was thinking about this last night. You know, about 3% of the U.S. population are Jewish, and so that 3% is the same in the armed forces. But I've seen many World War I German cemeteries in this same area. And there are a lot of Jews in their World War I cemeteries. Quite fascinating. So we're going to hear what Granddad had to say about the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. October the 22nd, from 1:10 p.m., we were eating when the order came in to what they call police up the woods in front of us, but what I call drive the Deutsch, or the Germans, out of the woods. We moved up on the Germans and got to within 40 to 50 feet of them before they knew we were there. You understand, the woods were thick. This was a hell of a job, as we had no barrage to give us some kind of help. A lot of our boys were wounded in this battle, and I'm here to tell you it was some battle too. The boys were getting bumped off like flies in the fall. Oh, sorry, I should have flipped that one. Well, what happened here? I don't know what this is all about. Anyway, it's a beautiful landscape, and the morning fog was lifting, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. And I've been by that same spot many, many times, and it's the only time I've seen it like this. But at this point, the Germans are in full retreat. Okay, that's what's happening now. That we're way on the east side of the Meuse-Argonne, And then we come to the Meuse River. Now, this is where I, in particular, hear my grandfather telling me this story. You can see the Meuse River. This is nothing you just wade across. This is a real river. And the French had built, there was a nice concrete bridge over the river. And on the east side of the river was the little French town of Stenay. Granddad said as the Germans retreated, they blew up the bridge to slow the American effort. So Granddad told me this is on the 11th of November, or the 10th of November. They were camped on the west side of the Meuse River. And Granddad told me, he said, we stayed up all night long and talked because we knew in the morning we all were going to die. Because our orders were to attack Stenay in the morning. He said, we knew we had to get across that bridge and go from, because chunks of the concrete were sticking up in the water, and they had to, in his words, we had to pick our way across to get across the river. And he said, we knew there was a German machine gun in every window of that town. But for some reason, the Germans in Stenay had retreated in the night. This whole armistice thing, everybody knew it was coming. But right there in this little pocket, the Germans had retreated. Now, I mentioned earlier that the morning of the 11th was one of the bloodiest days of the entire war. The Allies wanted to punish the Germans. The Germans were fighting in self-defense, and the whole thing was a bloodbath. So just south of this point was a bloodbath, and just to the north was a bloodbath. But in this little pocket at Stenay, the Germans had retreated. Had the Germans not surrendered during the night at Stenay, it's very likely I would not be standing here today. So, let me read what Granddad has to say about that night. He said, early in the morning, we received the news. I have to picture an army messenger on horseback went through their little encampment and said that the armistice was to be signed. See, they didn't know it had already been signed, but they knew the war would stop by this messenger at 11. So we received the news that the armistice was to be signed. We all kind of raised up with relief and then sank back down and said, bull, this can't be over. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning and almost daylight. And about 9 o'clock that morning, we went to Stenay. I was in the 3rd platoon and I was the 8th or 9th man across the river. And I remember picking their way across the dynamited chunks of concrete. And then he talks about Spencer. Maybe I ought to do this right, huh? Okay. So here's the Meuse River, and then he's talking about Spencer. Now, Spencer was from Pueblo, Colorado, and they were foxhole. They shared the same foxhole through most of the war, and they remained close friends to the end. Spencer and we got into town. Spencer and I took 4 prisoners and then got into a French house and had something to eat. The French people were sure glad to see us. And I'm here to tell you, we were sure surprised after 11 o'clock when we could hear no more guns firing. I think that's a beautiful way to finish that horrible, horrible war. The guns had roared for over 4 years. There were 10 million combatants that were killed, and another 10 million were civilians who died of disease and famine. So a total toll of some 20 million people in this horrible war. And it was at this time, after this battle, see, we go back to the April the 6th, when the United States declared war on Germany. The United States at that time was rated the 14th military in the world. 14th. And at the end of this battle, the United States had become a superpower. So this is where it happened. This is very important history. And this is usually where I give the armistice talk, but we got that out of the way early. So, now this is wonderful. This is part of the 90th anniversary ceremonies. And there was so much going on. And this plane was flown from Paris. It's almost 200 miles. As the plane flies or the crow flies, right? So this is a big deal. And he's doing loop-de-loops and diving the crowd and all this amazing stuff. This is a Sopwith Camel, a British plane. Isn't that amazing? But well, you can't see the pilot. But I could. The pilot was Snoopy. And I think my joke went over the heads of a lot of young people here right now, but Jerry understands. You know the cartoon Snoopy. The cartoon artist, Charles Schulz. For years, right? He had Snoopy in the biplane at the San Miguel Offensive. So it's a good joke. But there is a Sopwith Camel. Now, we're getting close to the end. This magnificent monument is called Mont Faucon. It's an American monument, and it was built to honor the sacrifice, the American sacrifice at the Meuse-Argonne offensive. We had about, well, let's say it this way. From the 26th of September to November the 11th is 47 days. There were 26,000 American deaths in those 47 days. How do you get your mind around that? So here's our monument, and this was the 90th anniversary ceremony, and they had projected General Pershing's image on our monument. It was just magnificent, just magnificent. So here we are going to leave the Argonne, the Meuse-Argonne region. And the 89th was chosen to go into France. We had an occupation in France, Germany, that not many people know about. And the 89th was chosen to be one of the divisions to go into Germany for this occupation. And this photograph, this is when the 89th Division crossed this amazing bridge. This is the Saar River, which was also very famous in World War II. And Granddad, I think this was December the 6th, 1918. And on the left side is the little town of Echternach, Luxembourg. And then on the right side of the bridge is Germany. So this is where they crossed. Now this bridge was originally a Roman bridge, and Echternach was a Roman town. But what I want you to watch is this monk he's part of the bridge. I've walked over this bridge many times, and it was built into the bridge. So I knew that when in World War II, when the Germans retreated, just like they did at Stenay in World War I, they would have blown this bridge up to slow the American advance. And it took me years, but I finally found it. Look at that. Look how the Germans dynamited that bridge. But look who's still standing. Isn't that remarkable? The monk is still there. After all that dynamite, it's just, I'd say miraculous, I guess, is would fit, but that's the story. Now, there's the bridge today, and there's the monk, still there. You can go see him today. Now, we're in Germany. We're in the little town of Flagren. And Granddad and this was probably a platoon or just, part of his regiment. They were billeted with German families. And so they were in this little town. It's close to Prüm, which we talked about earlier. And they were billeted with German families. So, and people have asked me, well, what did the Germans think of that? We're the enemy, They were thrilled. They were starving. Germany was far beyond the end of their rope. They were all starving. And the Americans brought food. And so the Germans were absolutely elated to see the Americans come. Now, over that hill, and about 10 miles to the south, is this little town called Philippsheim. And Granddad and Spencer, and I think about 6 others, were ordered to go to Philippsheim over Christmas. There was a railroad depot they were supposed to watch or guard. And so I thought, well, I've got to go to Philippsheim. But what happened, it's Christmas, it was Christmas Eve, and the 8 guys were billeted with German families. And Granddad and Spencer were together, and this nice family, it was Christmas Eve. It's probably 4 in the afternoon, something like that. And they got together and they talked and they said, let's go see some of the other guys and get out of here for a little while so this nice family can have their Christmas dinner. So they did. They took off. Came back in a couple hours thinking they would have eaten by now. And they walked in the front door, and that family was sitting in the living room waiting for them so they could all have Christmas together. Humanity had been restored. Isn't that a beautiful story? So, now I'm in Philipsheim. It was June. It's hot. And Philipsheim, if there's 10 houses, I'm probably overcounting. It's a tiny, tiny little hamlet. But there was a little inn, and I was walking by this little inn, and I was thirsty. It was hot, and I thought maybe I can get a bottle of water in here. So I walked inside, and there was this nice young man behind the desk, and he spoke perfect English. And I said, I'm looking for some water. Do you have a bottle of water or something? He said, oh, I'll get you a glass of water. And he ran into the kitchen, and he came out with a glass of water and gave it to me. And I took a long, long drink, and that was just so beautiful. And then he sat back down, and he looked at me. He said, why are you here? Well, I told him the Christmas story. He grabbed my arm, went running down a hallway in this little inn, and we burst outside into the backyard, and there's Grandpa Johann, this young man's grandfather, maybe great-grandfather. He was 92. And I shook hands with Grandpa Johann. He's out here splitting wood at 92, right? And I shook hands with him. It was like putting my hand into a vice. And the young man excitingly told Grandpa Johann the Christmas story. And his eyes got as big as saucers. And he, in German, tells his grandson, he said, my parents always told me that when I was a baby, American soldiers stayed with us over Christmas. Well, the 3 of us were just shocked. I mean, I fell over. And we kind of talked amongst us, and there's so few houses there now. What was there in Christmas of 1918? And we decided we'd never know if they were in, Granddad was in Johann's family home, but the 3 of us decided we were certainly close enough. So it was an amazing moment in this grand journey that I've been on. Now, we're wrapping this thing up. This monument, ABMC, is at the Brest Harbor. And Brest is the furthest western town in France. and there was a huge harbor, and it was a supply point for the United States, and so a lot went on here. And so after the war in the 30s, the ABMC came and built this beautiful monument on the highest point of land overlooking the harbor. And of course, it resembles a lighthouse. Now, the story is, this is amazing. So in 1942, the Germans had complete control of France. They're back, right? So they have complete control of France. But they wanted a command bunker on that high point of land. So this is the truth, God's honest truth. On July the 4th, 1942, the Germans dynamited our monument and built a command bunker. Now, isn't that giving the United States the middle finger? The reason I went to Brest and to see this monument was because my grandfather and his regiment went home from Brest Harbor on the USS Leviathan on May the 15th, 1919. I often imagine when Granddad and all his pals and his regiment were going home on that ship, they must have felt very proud of their accomplishments. And they certainly had no way they could know that in 20 years it would all start over again. So in 1957, the ABMC went back and rebuilt the monument to all the original plans and specifications on top of the bunker. I even went in the bunker, but it's just unbelievable. So this monument is sitting on a German bunker. So we're going to close out here. This photo is very dear to me. I was in France in September of 16. Of course, on my right side in the red dress is my friend Helen Patton. And this lovely lady is Sandy Pershing. She married the great general's oldest grandson. She was the last living Pershing. And she was such a delight and such a good friend. And there was a deep connection with Pershing and Patton. Of course, it goes back to Columbus, New Mexico, the punitive expedition. And of course, I'm wearing my Rolling W, but this is a wonderful photograph that I treasure. And Sandy sadly passed away about 3 years ago. So with this, I'm going to close. And thank you all for coming and listening to all this. And I hope that I can come to your classrooms one of these days and we'll talk about more, because there's a lot more. But thank you all so much for coming. And on Veterans Day, we'll honor our veterans that we can never repay. And really, to me, every day is Veterans Day. So thank you all so very much.